The wind swept across the main street as if carrying ancient memories, stirring dust between worn wooden facades and shop windows that reflected a past more vivid than the present. It was late afternoon in a small town in the American Midwest, one of those where silence speaks volumes and each step echoes like a confession. The yellowish streetlights began to come on one by one, but they didn't warm the chill that settled in the heart of... Michael Carter, a veteran of the American War, stood in the middle of the sidewalk, his hands in his pockets, his gaze lost. He lay there, motionless, as if the world had moved on without warning him. And perhaps it had. Michael Carter was a veteran of the United States wars. It wasn't written on his forehead, nor emblazoned on visible plaques or medals. It was in his slightly hunched shoulders, in the way his brown eyes observed everything from a distance, always calculating escape routes, always alert to the slightest noise. It was in his restrained breathing, in the rigidity of his body that never fully relaxed. The uniform had been left behind years ago, but the war had never truly left him. It remained there, silent, occupying space within him, like a constant echo that wouldn't fade. The distant sound of a train cutting through the landscape brought a hazy memory. Not a sharp flash, but a heavy, almost physical sensation. Michael looked toward the horizon, where the sky was beginning to take on shades of dark blue and burnt orange. He knew that transition between day and night well. On the battlefields where he served as a U.S. Army war veteran, that was the most dangerous time. The light flickered, the outlines blurred, and uncertainty took over. Even now, on American soil, his body reacted as if he were still there. The town seemed too small to hold such grand stories. Lined-up houses, porches creaking in the wind, American flags proudly displayed, some already faded with time. People passed by him without truly seeing him, quick greetings, curious glances that drifted away before any real connection. To them, Michael Carter was just another middle-aged man trying to fit in. To himself, he was a war veteran, trying to survive the silence after the noise. There was something in the air that night, an almost imperceptible tension, like the moment before a storm. Michael felt it in his skin, the same way he felt it when, years ago, the radio went silent and the world held its breath. He couldn't explain it, but he knew it. Something was about to happen, something that would stir up wounds he believed had healed, or at least been buried deep enough not to bleed in public. He took a few steps, then felt the creak of the wood beneath his worn boots. The boots weren't military, but he still chose sturdy footwear, as if the ground could give way at any moment. Each step was measured, each movement economical, a habit of a war veteran that never fades. The reflection in the window of a closed shop returned to him an image he barely recognized. Dark hair with gray strands, unshaven, deep lines on his face. A face that had seen too much. A face that had learned to hide emotions because, in war, feeling too much could kill. The silence was broken by laughter coming from a cafe across the street. Young, carefree, living a life that seemed unattainable. Michael watched for a moment, not with envy, but with a respectful distance, like someone watching a film that no longer belongs to them. He had served his country. He had been a war veteran, sent far away, trained to resist, to obey, to protect. And now he was there, back to square one, trying to understand exactly where he fit into that ordinary scene that for him had never been simple again. That night would mark the beginning of something irreversible. Even though Michael Carter didn't know it, the weight he carried would begin to be confronted. The silence would be broken. The past, which he had tried to keep at bay, would find a way to present itself, not in explosions or gunshots, but in words. Words that wound as much as any weapon. Words spoken by someone who had no idea who he really was. Someone who would never imagine that this seemingly ordinary man, standing under a dimly lit lamppost, was a United States war veteran who had already lost more than anyone could possibly imagine. In that moment, suspended between day and night, Michael Carter took a deep breath. The world remained too calm for someone who had learned to distrust tranquility. And as so many times before in his life as a war veteran, he felt, not with his mind, but with something deeper, that he was about to be tested again. Not by bullets or explosions, but by something equally devastating, the judgment of those who had never been on the battlefield. Current life Of Michael Carter, a US war veteran, he followed a rhythm that wasn't exactly calm, but too predictable for someone who had lived on the edge between life and death. He lived in a small rented house on the outskirts of town near the railway line, where the sound of trains passing by in the early morning served as a constant reminder of movement, something that contrasted with the stagnation he felt inside. The house was simple, almost empty. Few pieces of furniture, bare walls, no photographs on display. It wasn't carelessness, it was a choice. For a war veteran, too many objects meant too many memories, and memories had a habit of striking when least expected. Michael woke up every day before sunrise. The habit came from the war, from the years when sleeping beyond what was necessary was a non-existent luxury. Even now, far from the battlefield, the war veteran's body remained alert. He would sit on the edge of the bed for a few seconds, breathing deeply, assessing the silence, listening to the house as if he were in hostile territory. Only then would he get up. The bathroom mirror reflected a man who looked older than he actually was. His brown eyes carried chronic weariness, and there was something about them that the townspeople couldn't decipher. A mixture of vigilance and emotional distance that didn't fit with the tranquility of that place. Breakfast was always the same. Strong black coffee, no sugar, and something quick to stave off hunger. Michael ate in silence, sitting at the table with his back to the wall. Another habit of a war veteran. He needed to see the door. He needed to know how to exit if necessary. It wasn't paranoia, he told himself. It was learned survival. After that, he dressed simply. Jeans, sturdy boots, an old jacket that had seen better days. Nothing flashy. He didn't want to be noticed. For a war veteran trying to reintegrate, invisibility sometimes seemed the safest way to exist. Michael worked doing odd jobs around town. Repairs, deliveries, painting, anything that didn't require too many questions. The locals knew him as the quiet guy. Some knew he had served in the army, but few understood what that really meant. To them, war veteran was a distant label, something associated with parades or patriotic speeches. For Michael, being a US war veteran was a permanent condition, an identity that shaped every reaction, every choice, every prolonged silence. He avoided long conversations. Not out of dislike, but because too many words could open doors he had kept locked for years. Still, he greeted everyone politely. The grocery store owner, the lady at the laundromat, the mechanic on the corner. Small nods, short answers. The city was too small to disappear completely, but big enough for him to stay on the fringes. Michael walked the streets like someone who belongs, and at the same time doesn't. A war veteran back home, but without the real feeling of being at home. The nights were the hardest part. When work ended and silence settled in, there were no more distractions. Michael would sit on the porch of the house, looking at the sky, smoking silently, even knowing it wasn't good for him. Sometimes the distant sound of fireworks, birthdays, games, celebrations, made his body react before his mind could intervene. His heart would race, his muscles would tense. In fractions of a second, he would cease to be just a man in a small town and become a war veteran again in the midst of chaos. Then came the shame. It always came. Shame for not being able to get over it, as some said. Shame for still carrying the war inside him. Michael didn't talk about it with anyone. Therapy seemed too distant, and admitting he needed help still sounded like weakness to his mind, trained to resist. The difficulty of reintegration wasn't just finding work or a place to live. It was learning to exist in a world that didn't demand constant vigilance. A world where people didn't understand why he sat with his back to the wall in restaurants, or why he avoided crowds, or why his eyes darted back whenever someone mentioned the word war. The neighbors watched him with silent curiosity. Some respected him, others judged him. There were those who thought he was just a bitter man, someone who didn't try hard enough to move on. They didn't see the invisible scars. They didn't see the dreams interrupted by the sound of explosions that no longer existed. They didn't see the weight of being a war veteran who survived when others weren't so lucky. Despite everything, Michael maintained a rigid routine. Light exercise every morning, even when his body complained. Excessive organization at home, fixed schedules. For a war veteran, discipline was an anchor. Without it, everything seemed to threaten to crumble. He didn't allow himself to relax too much. He didn't allow himself to wait too long. Hope, he had learned early on, could be dangerous. Still, there were rare moments when Michael felt something close to normality. Walks at dusk, the smell of freshly cut grass, the distant sound of children playing. In those moments, he almost believed he could rebuild something. Almost. But there was always an invisible barrier between him and the rest of the world. A line that separated those who knew the war from those who had only heard about it. Michael Carter's current life wasn't dramatic on the outside. There were no scandals, no major visible conflicts. But inside, each day was a silent battle. A constant struggle to exist as a civilian without ceasing to be who he was. A U.S. war veteran trying to find meaning in a place that never had to learn to survive like him. And, without even knowing it, this seemingly unchanging routine was about to be broken. Because at some point in that solitary daily life, the world would decide to test him not as a soldier, but as a man. Before becoming a United States war veteran, before carrying on his body and mind scars that time would not erase, Michael Carter. He was just a boy growing up in a small town in the American Midwest, much like the one he would one day return to, changed. He was born and raised in a place where everyone knew each other by name, where the houses had wide porches, well-kept lawns, and American flags proudly flown. His father worked long hours at a local mechanic shop. His mother was a teacher at the town's public school. They weren't rich, but there was dignity, structure, and clear values within that simple white wooden house. Michael grew up hearing stories about responsibility, character, and service. His father spoke little, but when he did, his words carried weight. He taught his son that a man's worth was measured by what he did when no one was watching. His mother, in turn, taught him empathy, patience, and the value of listening. These two forces shaped who Michael was before the war, a reserved, observant young man, deeply loyal to those he loved. He wasn't the most popular kid in school, nor the most talkative, but he was reliable, someone you could count on. As a teenager, Michael dreamed of a simple life. He wanted to work, maybe open a small business, build a family in that same city. He enjoyed walks, driving along the road at dusk, feeling that the world was predictable. He believed in the idea of a linear future: study, work, marry, grow old. War, for him, was something distant, something that happened in other places, with other people. He never imagined that one day he would become a veteran of the United States wars. Everything began to change when Michael approached adulthood and realized the limitations around him. The city offered few opportunities, and he didn't want to be a burden on his parents. At the same time, the country was going through a period of tension. The news constantly spoke of conflicts abroad, threats, attacks, instability. Amidst this scenario, the discourse on duty, patriotism, and protection gained strength. For a young man like Michael, raised with solid values and a strong sense of responsibility, this resonated deeply. Enlisting wasn't impulsive. Michael thought about it for months. He talked to his father, who didn't try to stop him, but made it clear that the decision would have consequences. He talked to his mother, who cried silently but supported him. Deep down, Michael believed that serving was the right thing to do. He wasn't seeking glory. He wasn't seeking violence. He was seeking purpose. He wanted to be useful. He wanted to protect something bigger than himself. In that moment, the idea of becoming a war veteran seemed distant, almost abstract. When he finally enlisted in the United States Army, Michael still carried a certain naivete. The training was tough, but he stood out for his discipline and ability to remain calm under pressure. Instructors saw him as someone reliable, someone who didn't break easily. He learned quickly. He learned to obey orders, to work as a team, to suppress emotions when necessary. Each day distanced him a little further from the young man he had once been, and he barely noticed it happening. Before the war, Michael still believed he could come back whole. He believed he could separate the soldier from the man. In letters home, he downplayed difficulties, spoke of camaraderie, of learning. He didn't want to worry his parents. He didn't want to admit, even to himself, that he felt fear. For him, fear was something to be controlled, not shared. This was perhaps the first step towards the silence that would later define his life as a war veteran. There were also dreams he never fully verbalized. Michael imagined that, after his service, he could study, perhaps use his military benefits to build something better. He thought about relationships, about finding someone who understood him. But these dreams began to fragment as training gave way to the first, real missions. The transition was too fast. One day he was learning tactics. The next, he was being prepared to enter a scenario where the rules of civilian life didn't exist. The Michael before the war believed in good and evil as clear concepts. He believed that doing the right thing always led to good results. He believed that courage was the absence of fear. He didn't yet know that courage, in fact, was continuing even when fear took over. He didn't yet know that some decisions didn't have a right answer. He didn't yet know that surviving would often be harder than falling. When he left, his parents hugged him tightly. The city gathered to say goodbye. There was pride in their eyes, applause, words of encouragement. Michael promised to return. At that moment, no one there imagined that the young man who was leaving would not be the same one who would return. No one imagined the real cost of that choice, not even him. Before the war, Michael Carter was whole. He had doubts, fears, dreams and plans, but he was whole. The battlefield hadn't yet divided his identity into before and after. It hadn't yet transformed that ordinary young man into a United States war veteran bearing invisible scars. All of that was yet to come. And when it did, it would forever change not only who he was, but how he saw the world and himself. The war did not come to Michael Carter, a veteran of the United States wars. It was like an isolated explosion, a single, easily identifiable moment of rupture. It seeped in gradually, silently at first, like a chill that starts at the feet and rises without asking permission. The first impact wasn't the sound of gunfire, nor the smell of smoke. It was the sudden realization that the world he knew didn't exist there. On the battlefield, nothing worked as promised in training. The rules were fragile, morale was relative, and time unpredictable. Michael quickly learned that being a war veteran begins long before returning home. It begins the moment fear ceases to be an occasional visitor and takes up residence in his chest. The nights were the worst. The heavy silence before an operation made his heart pound too hard, and he needed to concentrate on his breathing to keep it from showing. As a war veteran in training, he understood early on that showing vulnerability could put others at risk. So he swallowed his fear. He kept everything bottled up, and that came at a price. The days blended into an exhausting sequence of constant tension. Michael watched young faces harden rapidly. Comrades with whom he shared meals and simple jokes disappeared overnight. Some returned wounded, others did not return at all. There was no time for proper mourning. A war veteran learns that the mission continues, even when the heart wants to stop. Michael continued. He always continued. Because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering. There was one specific day, not the only one, but the most persistent, that remained etched in his memory. Not like a clear film, but like sensory fragments. The excessive heat, the weight of the equipment, the muffled sound of his own blood in his ears. A decision made in seconds, under extreme pressure. A comrade who trusted him. A mistake that didn't seem like a mistake until it was too late. Michael didn't like to remember the details, but they came back unbidden. As a war veteran, he had learned that some memories don't need to be complete to hurt. After that day, something changed. Not outwardly, he continued to follow orders, to be efficient, to be reliable. Internally, however, a crack formed. Guilt began to silently take hold. Guilt for having survived. Guilt for having returned unscathed when others were not so lucky. Guilt for decisions that rationally were inevitable, but emotionally impossible to accept. For a veteran of American wars, the line between responsibility and guilt is dangerously thin. The flashbacks didn't come as organized scenes. They came as sensations. A smell that made no sense on American soil. A metallic noise that made his body react before his mind. The simple slamming of a door could transport him to another place, another time. Michael's body reacted as if he was still there, even when he knew he was safe. It was the invisible legacy of being a war veteran. The battlefield is never truly left behind. He began to sleep less. When he did sleep, his dreams were interrupted. He would wake up sweating, his heart racing, his hands clenched as if still holding something he needed to protect. Over time, he began to avoid sleep. He would stay awake until exhaustion won. For Michael, a war veteran, sleep meant losing control. And losing control was dangerous, even when there was no danger at all. The war also changed how he viewed people. Before, Michael believed in goodness as something predominant. Afterward, he began to see layers, ambiguities, hidden intentions. It wasn't cynicism, it was survival. As a war veteran, he had learned that blind trust could cost lives. This lesson would stay with him forever, hindering any attempt at emotional closeness in the future. There were moments of genuine camaraderie, it's true. Moments when laughter arose amidst the chaos, as a desperate way to remember they were still human. These moments made the losses even more painful, because when a comrade fell, it wasn't just a soldier. It was someone who knew his fears, his jokes, his silences. Each loss accumulated within Michael, creating a weight he had nowhere to lay. When his service finally ended and the return home approached, Michael believed, for a brief moment, that everything would be behind him. That simply crossing the ocean would be enough to leave the war on the other side. But the truth revealed itself too quickly. The war had returned with him, not in medals or speeches, but in involuntary reactions, in intrusive thoughts, in an emotional exhaustion that no rest could resolve. He had officially become a United States war veteran, but no one had prepared him for what that truly meant. He one who had done what needed to be done, and now needed to learn to live. The battlefield scars weren't visible to an outsider. There were no open wounds, no obvious scars. But inside, Michael carried a complete map of everything he had lost. Friends, certainties, parts of himself. He didn't feel like a hero. He never had. He felt like some with the consequences. The trauma manifested itself not only as pain. It manifested itself as distance, as difficulty in feeling joy without distrust, as an inability to imagine a future that wasn't always on the verge of collapse. For a war veteran, planning seemed risky. War had taught him that everything could end in seconds. Michael didn't talk about it, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know how. Words seemed too small to contain what he felt, and deep down there was fear. Fear of being seen as weak, fear of being misunderstood, fear that, by opening the door, everything would slip away at once. So, he moved forward carrying the trauma like a silent burden, believing that this was the inevitable price of being a veteran of the United States wars. The battlefield was geographically behind him, but it remained alive within him, and without even realizing it. Every step Michael took in his new life was influenced by those experiences. The trauma didn't define him completely, but it shaped everything around him. And it would be precisely this weight, invisible, persistent, that would make the events to come even more decisive. The life of Michael Carter Michael, a U.S. war veteran, lived at a predictably slow pace, almost numb. For a war veteran, predictability was a form of security. Nothing unexpected meant fewer risks, fewer triggers, less chance of the past erupting without warning. For months, perhaps years, Michael believed he could go through the rest of his life this way, working, returning home, avoiding deep ties, existing more than living, until something or someone broke that fragile balance. It all began on an ordinary afternoon in the small American town where Michael lived. The sky was heavy, laden with low clouds, as if announcing a storm that never arrived. For a war veteran, that kind of sky always brought an unease that was difficult to explain. He felt it in his body even before he understood it with his mind. Still, he continued his routine. He stopped at a small local market, one of those places where everyone knows each other by sight, even without exchanging many words. It was there that the event unfolded, in a simple, almost banal way, like so many things that change lives. Michael heard an argument near the entrance. Raised voices, a tone of contempt that he instantly recognized. An older man, rigid posture, clothes too expensive for that place, was speaking aggressively to a younger woman. There was something humiliating in the way he chose his words. For Michael, a war veteran accustomed to quickly reading the atmosphere, the scene triggered an internal alarm that was impossible to ignore. He tried to move on. He told himself it wasn't his problem. A war veteran learns, sometimes cruelly, that he can't save everyone. Still, his feet slowed, his senses sharpened. The man's tone rose. The woman tried to defend herself, but her voice was constantly cut off. There was fear there. Not the immediate fear of physical violence, but the corrosive fear of being publicly diminished. Michael recognized that expression. He'd seen it before, on civilians caught in conflicts bigger than themselves, in war zones where abusive authority masqueraded as legitimate power. As a war veteran, he knew that silence, in those situations, is also a choice, and that awareness began to weigh on him from within. The man then said something that struck Michael like a silent gunshot. Something about not being worthy, about not being good enough, about not being valuable enough. The words weren't directed at Michael, but they resonated painfully with him. A war veteran who struggled daily with his own sense of worthlessness after returning to civilian life felt the blow personally. Michael took a deep breath. His first impulse was to leave. The second, stronger, older, was to intervene. The internal conflict lasted only a few seconds, but for a war veteran accustomed to making quick decisions under pressure, those seconds carried enormous weight. To intervene meant exposing himself. It meant drawing attention. It meant perhaps opening an emotional door he had kept locked for a long time. He took a step forward. Michael's presence changed the atmosphere immediately, not because he raised his voice or adopted an aggressive posture, but because there was something about his demeanor that didn't ask for permission. Years of war had shaped his body language. The older man perceived this, even without consciously understanding it. There was a brief silence. The woman looked up, surprised. Michael spoke little, direct words, calm, firm. He asked the man to lower his voice. He said that this was not the place for that kind of behavior. For a war veteran, controlling one's tone of voice is a vital skill. He wasn't there to win an argument, but to stop an injustice. The man reacted with disdain at first. He questioned who Michael thought he was. It was then that something curious happened. Michael didn't answer immediately. He simply held his gaze, a gaze that carried things that didn't need to be said, the kind of look that war veterans develop after having seen more than they would like. The man recoiled, albeit slightly. The situation dissolved without a major confrontation. The man left, irritated but restrained. The market resumed its normal bustle as if nothing had happened. But for Michael, a veteran of the United States wars, nothing was normal. His heart was racing. Not from fear, but from something more complex, the feeling of having crossed an invisible line. The woman thanked her. Her voice was low, but sincere. She introduced herself as Emily. There was something in her eyes, weariness, restrained strength, wounded dignity, that touched Michael in an unexpected way. They exchanged few words. Michael tried to end things quickly, as he always did. A war veteran avoids prolonging interactions, but before they said goodbye, Emily said something simple. "Thank you for not pretending you didn't see." That phrase echoed uncomfortably within him, because Michael knew that, for a long time, he himself had pretended not to see his own pain, his own needs, his own humanity after the war. In the following days, that encounter wouldn't leave his mind. For a war veteran accustomed to compartmentalizing emotions, this was unusual. He wondered why that specific situation had affected him so deeply. He had witnessed injustices before. He had intervened on other occasions, but something there seemed different. Perhaps it was the unintentional mirroring. Perhaps it was the silent recognition between two people carrying different, yet equally profound, burdens. The triggering event wasn't just the confrontation at the market. It was what it stirred in Michael. A new unease. An unsettling question. What if he still had something to offer the world besides surviving? For a war veteran who felt out of place in civilian life, that question was dangerous. Because hope, when suppressed for too long, can hurt as much as loss. A few days later, Michael met Emily again, this time under different but no less significant circumstances. The conversation progressed a little further. He discovered fragments of her life, difficulties, family conflicts, a controlling father, suffocating expectations. Michael listened more than he spoke. As a war veteran, he had learned that listening is often the greatest act of presence. Without realizing it, Michael had been pulled out of the safe bubble he had built around himself. The calling event didn't require weapons or complex strategies. It demanded something far riskier for an emotionally wounded war veteran: involvement, connection. The real possibility that, in helping someone, he would have to confront parts of himself he preferred to keep buried. And from that moment on, Michael's life began to move in a direction he never would have planned, because the war had taught him to survive. But that encounter was about to teach him something far more difficult: to feel again. For Michael Carter, as a US war veteran, courage was never synonymous with the absence of fear. War had taught him the exact opposite. Courage is acting despite it. Even so, there was a stark difference between advancing under clear orders with a defined objective and advancing in civilian life where there were no maps, hierarchies, or emotional protocols. And it was precisely in this uncertain territory that Michael found himself after meeting Emily. In the days that followed, the war veteran tried to resume his routine with almost military discipline. He woke up early, kept to his schedule, avoided overthinking. But something had changed. The world around him seemed closer, more invasive. The voices of the small American town, previously just background noise, now carried meaning. For a war veteran accustomed to living on high alert, this change was uncomfortable. He felt he was letting his guard down, and that had always been dangerous. Michael tried to convince himself that his intervention in the market had been merely an automatic reflex, a trained instinct, nothing more than that. But the war veteran knew he was lying to himself. If it were just instinct, he would have forgotten by now. If it were just an impulse, he wouldn't be reliving every detail, every word, every look. The real test came a few days later when Michael learned, almost by chance, that Emily was facing an even more delicate situation. That man from the market wasn't just an arrogant stranger. He was her father, a detail that fell like an unexpected weight on Michael's chest. As a war veteran, he knew hierarchical conflicts, abusive authorities, figures who imposed themselves through fear. But this was different. It was intimate. It was familiar. It was an emotional battlefield where there were no clear trenches. Emily didn't ask for help directly, and that made everything more difficult. She commented, in a restrained tone, about a recent argument, about the constant pressure to live a life she didn't feel was hers. Michael listened silently, like a war veteran trained to pick up on what isn't said. There was an implicit plea there, wrapped in pride and weariness. A plea that didn't come in the form of words, but in long pauses and averted glances. Michael's act of courage began there, in recognizing that he wanted to help. For a war veteran marked by loss, wanting to help was already a risk, because wanting to help leads to caring, and caring opens the door to pain. Even so, he didn't back down. The decision wasn't immediate. Michael spent an entire night awake, sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at the dark floor of his room. Memories of the war came in gentle but persistent waves. He remembered the comrades he tried to protect and couldn't. He remembered the silent promises he made to himself, never again to get more involved than necessary. As a war veteran, he had learned that attachment can be too costly. But he also remembered the moments when he intervened and saved lives. The faces he never forgot. The sense of purpose that only existed when he did the right thing, even when he was afraid. That memory, more than any other, weighed heavily on his decision. The next day, Michael sought out Emily, not as a savior, not as a hero, but as a war veteran who knew the value of not facing battles alone. He offered something simple, his presence. He said that if she needed him, he would be there. He said that no one deserved to be diminished in that way. The words came out carefully, as if each one could detonate something hidden. Emily reacted with surprise and resistance. There had been years of conditioning there, years of hearing that she needed to prove herself, that she needed to fit in. Michael recognized that immediately. As a war veteran, he too had heard in different ways that his worth was contingent on performance, resilience, and silence. The real act of courage happened when Michael decided to confront Emily's father again, not on impulse, not out of anger, but out of humanity. He knew that conversation could go wrong. It could humiliate him. It could expose him. It could trigger reactions he wasn't prepared to handle emotionally. For a war veteran, facing a man armed with emotional contempt was, in a way, more difficult than facing a visible enemy. The meeting took place in a neutral but tense environment. Emily's father tried to repeat the pattern, to disqualify, intimidate, belittle. Michael felt his body react automatically, muscles tensing, breathing controlled, senses heightened. The war had never completely left him, but this time, he wasn't there to impose force. He was there to set limits. Michael spoke about respect, about dignity, about the right of each person to choose their own path. He didn't immediately reveal that he was a war veteran. He didn't use that as a shield or an argument from authority, because that act of courage wasn't about proving who he was. It was about standing up for what was right. When the man tried to belittle him, implying that Michael was nothing but a nobody, something shifted. Michael felt the old wound reopen. That familiar feeling of not belonging, of not being enough. But instead of retreating, he took a deep breath. As a war veteran, he had learned that controlling one's own reaction is a powerful form of strength. He responded calmly, making it clear that he didn't need anyone's approval to know his worth. He said that Emily wasn't an extension of her father's expectations. He said that love isn't built on fear. Every sentence was measured, every silence intentional. The conversation didn't end in reconciliation, but it ended in something equally important: breaking the cycle. As he left, Michael felt the weight of emotional exhaustion. His hands trembled slightly. It wasn't weakness. It was the cost of doing the right thing. For a war veteran, courage always came at a price. And he was willing to pay it. Emily noticed the change, not just in her father's behavior, but in herself. For the first time, someone had faced that situation without demanding anything in return, without trying to control her, without treating her as a problem to be solved. Michael didn't promise solutions. He promised respect. That night, alone again, Michael felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. A different kind of stillness. Not the empty stillness of survival, but the stillness that comes after acting in alignment with one's values. As a war veteran, he had always believed that his best self had remained on the battlefield. But at that moment, he began to suspect that perhaps the war hadn't taken everything. Michael's act of courage and humanity wasn't grand in the eyes of the world. It didn't make the newspapers. It didn't earn applause. But for a war veteran who had spent years believing he only knew how to destroy, that simple gesture proved something fundamental. He still knew how to protect. He still knew how to choose good. He still knew how to be human. And without fully realizing it, Michael had taken an irreversible step. Because from that moment on, he was no longer just reacting to life. He was, finally, participating in it. For Michael Carter, as a veteran of the United States wars, the greatest conflict had never been something external. War had taught him that visible enemies are paradoxically easier to confront. They have form, direction, strategy. The true conflict, the one that corrodes slowly, had always been internal. And now, as his connection with Emily deepened, this conflict emerged in full force, demanding more from him than any previous battle. The war veteran began to realize that helping Emily inevitably meant looking at himself. Each conversation with her, each gesture of silent trust, stirred old wounds beneath the surface. Michael felt something he had avoided for years: the possibility of being truly seen. For a war veteran who had learned to survive through emotional isolation, this possibility was terrifying. The small town in the American heartland began to react, Gazes lingered. Whispers arose. In places like this, nothing goes unnoticed. Michael had always accepted being invisible there. The quiet man, the war veteran no one bothered. But now he was the talk of the town, and that awakened an old anxiety in him. In the war, he knew exactly who he was. Here, in civilian life, his identity seemed fragile. The major conflict intensified when Emily's father decided to act. Humiliated by the previous confrontation, he began to pressure his daughter more forcefully, using guilt, emotional blackmail, and veiled threats. Michael learned of this gradually, in fragments. Emily tried to downplay it, but the war veteran recognized the signs. He knew that kind of escalation. He had seen it in international conflicts and in smaller, yet equally destructive human dramas. Michael found himself torn. Intervening again could worsen the situation. Remaining silent would mean complicity. For a war veteran accustomed to life-or-death decisions, this ambiguity was excruciating. There was no manual. There were no orders from above, only consequences. At the same time, the internal conflict reached its peak. Michael's nights became more difficult. The war veteran would wake up with a racing heart, his mind filled with fragmented images of the battlefield. The past, which he had kept under tight control, began to seep into the present. Emily, unknowingly, had awakened something profound. The fear of losing again. The fear of failing. The fear of not being enough. As a war veteran, Michael carried a silent guilt. He blamed himself for surviving when others didn't return. He blamed himself for not being able to save everyone. And now, by becoming emotionally involved, he felt he was betraying an old promise. The promise never again to form bonds that could be forcibly ripped from him. The biggest conflict manifested itself concretely when Michael was confronted directly. Not on a battlefield, but in an ordinary setting. Emily's father approached him in public, using carefully chosen words to hurt. He questioned his usefulness. He insinuated that he was just a broken war veteran, someone without a future, without stability, with nothing to offer. The words struck Michael with surgical precision. For a war veteran struggling to redefine himself outside of his uniform, that attack found every insecurity he tried to hide. For a moment, the urge to react physically surged, quick, automatic, but he held back. The war had taught him to recognize when violence is a trap. The real conflict wasn't with that man. It was with the inner voice that was beginning to agree with him. Michael spent days in silence. He distanced himself from Emily. He justified to himself that he was protecting them both. For a war veteran, distancing himself seemed like a rational strategy. Better to retreat than to cause more harm. But the emotional cost was high. He felt the emptiness expanding again, as if he were returning to a previous state, safer, but profoundly lonely. Emily noticed the change. Her pain wasn't expressed in accusations, but in gentle questions. Questions Michael didn't know how to answer. How could she explain that his greatest enemy wasn't her father, nor the city, nor the past, but the deep conviction that he didn't deserve happiness? The major conflict reached its breaking point when Emily, exhausted, confronted Michael. She didn't ask for heroism. She didn't ask for protection. She asked for honesty. She asked him not to disappear without explanation. For a war veteran accustomed to carrying everything alone, that request was almost unbearable. Because it demanded vulnerability. It demanded admitting weakness. It demanded acknowledging that he also needed help. Michael tried to explain, but words failed him. The war veteran felt that if he spoke too much, something inside him might crumble. He feared that by allowing himself to feel, he wouldn't be able to control the avalanche of emotions that had been bottled up for years. Tension built up. The greater conflict didn't explode in shouts or violence. It exploded in silence, in withdrawal, in gazes that didn't meet, in nights that were too long. For a war veteran, that kind of conflict was cruel because it offered no clear targets or known strategies. Deep down, Michael knew he was facing the hardest battle of his life. Not because it involved physical danger, but because it required him to question the narrative he had constructed about himself. The narrative that he was merely a survivor. A man defined by war, a war veteran incapable of being loved without causing pain. The major conflict placed Michael in a complete impasse. To continue meant risking everything. To retreat meant confirming his worst fears. There was no victory without loss. There was no safety without sacrifice. And while the city continued its tranquil rhythm, seemingly oblivious, Michael felt he was on the verge of something irreversible. The war veteran, who had survived intense combat, now found himself cornered by a simple and devastating question. Did he have the courage to stay when everything inside him told him to run? This conflict could not be avoided. It could only be confronted. And the price, he knew, would be high, regardless of the choice. For Michael Carter. For a US war veteran, the breaking point didn't come as a sudden impact. It wasn't a scream, nor an explosive confrontation. It came as the most devastating things come to a war veteran: silent, accumulated, inevitable. It came when he was already too tired to continue pretending he was in control. The rupture began on a seemingly ordinary night in a small American town. The wind blew slowly between the houses, carrying the distant sound of a train crossing the town limits, a sound that always stirred something in Michael. During the war, trains meant displacement, farewells, uncertain return. Now that distant whistle seemed to announce something within him that was about to leave or be lost forever. Michael was alone at home. The solitude, once his fortress, had become a prison. As a war veteran, he had learned to endure physical isolation. But the emotional isolation now weighed unbearably. The walls seemed closer, the silence louder. He tried to occupy his mind by cleaning objects that were already clean, organizing things that didn't need organizing. All to avoid thinking. But the past doesn't respect distractions. Sitting on the living room floor, his back against the sofa, Michael felt his body give way. His breathing became short. His heart raced. The war veteran recognized the signs even before trying to deny them. It wasn't a typical panic attack. It was something deeper, something he had spent years avoiding confronting. The memories came without warning. Not as vivid images, but as sensations. The weight of the equipment on their shoulders, the metallic smell in the air, the constant tension of never knowing where the next danger would come from. For a war veteran, these memories never disappear. They just await the right moment to return. Michael closed his eyes, but that only intensified everything. He saw the faces of his comrades who hadn't returned. Men with whom he had shared quick laughs before missions, with whom he had made silent promises to come back safe and sound. He remembered, with painful clarity, the exact moment he realized he couldn't save everyone. He remembered the decision he made in seconds, a decision he would carry for the rest of his life. Guilt, old, familiar, suffocating, had taken hold of him. As a war veteran, Michael had always believed he needed to be strong. That falling apart meant failing those who didn't have the chance to grow old. For years, he convinced himself that living a full life would be a betrayal. That allowing himself to be loved would be an insult to the memory of those left behind. And then, the cruelest thought emerged, clear and direct: Emily would be better off without him. This idea lodged itself in Michael's mind like a sentence. He stood up abruptly, walking through the house as if searching for an invisible exit. Every object seemed laden with meaning. The jacket hanging on the chair, the boots near the door. Symbols of who he had been and who he was trying to stop being. The war veteran felt a dangerous urge, the desire to disappear. Not to die, but to erase himself from people's lives before he caused more pain. This impulse, he knew, was one of the most treacherous. In war, retreating without a strategy could be fatal. In life, too. That's when Michael found something that broke him for good. In a forgotten drawer, he found an old letter, carefully folded. A letter written by a war buddy, shortly before a mission from which only Michael returned. He hadn't read it in years. His hands trembled as he unfolded the yellowed paper. The words were simple. They spoke of hope. They spoke of returning home. They spoke of believing that life still had something in store for them. Michael couldn't continue reading. The war veteran felt the tears welling up like an uncontrollable force. It wasn't a restrained cry. It wasn't silent. It was deep, visceral, almost childlike. He let himself fall to the floor, the paper still in his hands, and for the first time in many years, he didn't try to quickly compose himself. He didn't try to be strong. He didn't try to control it. There, on that cold floor, Michael allowed himself to feel everything he had avoided for decades. He cried for his lost friends. He cried for the decisions that would never stop hurting. He cried for the life that could have been. He cried for the man he had become. He cried for the fear of loving and the even greater fear of never trying. For a war veteran, that collapse wasn't weakness. It was belated survival. In the midst of this collapse, Emily's thoughts returned, not as guilt, but as a memory. The look in her eyes when he listened to her without judgment. The way she thanked him for not pretending not to see. The way she unknowingly treated him not as a broken war veteran, but as a whole man. That memory was painful, because it made him realize how close he was to giving up on something that was perhaps the first real thing that had come into his life since the end of the war. The breaking point reached its peak when Michael admitted, aloud, something he had never said before. He was tired of just surviving. The war veteran wanted to live, and this desire, simple and terrifying, left him completely exposed. He stayed there for a long time. The crying gradually subsided, his breathing slowed, his exhausted body found a different kind of stillness. Not the empty stillness of denial, but the stillness that comes after passing through pain. Michael knew that something had changed irreversibly. The rupture hadn't destroyed him, but it had forced him to confront the truth he had avoided since returning from the war. He didn't have to carry everything alone. He didn't have to pay eternally for having survived. He didn't have to punish himself to honor the past. As a war veteran, he had always believed his mission ended when he returned home. That night, he realized he was wrong. His mission had simply changed form. The breaking point didn't bring immediate answers. It didn't bring ready-made solutions. It brought something more fundamental. Clarity. The clarity that running away was no longer an option. The clarity that if he retreated now, he would lose not only Emily, but the chance to reconcile with himself. And for a war veteran who had already lost so much, this would be the most definitive defeat of all. For Michael Carter, for this US war veteran, the climax wasn't a grand moment in the eyes of the world. There were no applause, no sirens, no public recognition. The climax was internal, silent, and profoundly transformative. It was the moment when the war veteran decided, for the first time since returning from the battlefield, not to retreat. The morning after his emotional breakdown dawned cold and clear in the small American town. Michael woke up on the living room floor, his body aching, his mind strangely lucid. As a war veteran, he was used to waking up in uncomfortable situations, but this awakening was different. There was no immediate panic. There was no denial. There was a heavy, yet necessary acceptance. He couldn't continue living as if he were always waiting for another war. Michael got up slowly, took a long shower, allowing the hot water to ease the accumulated tension. As the water ran, the war veteran thought about the previous night without trying to push away the memories. He knew that this internal struggle had been inevitable. The breakdown hadn't been a sign of failure, but a turning point. The climax was approaching not as an external event, but as a decision. Michael needed to choose between repeating the pattern of withdrawal or acting differently. For a war veteran, acting had always been easier than feeling. Now, he needed to do both. The first thing he did was look for Emily. The walk to her house seemed longer than ever. Each step was accompanied by a silent battle within him. Doubt whispered that it was too late, that he had already strayed too far, that she didn't need the emotional weight of a war veteran scarred by trauma. But, for the first time, Michael didn't let those voices control his movements. When Emily opened the door, the surprise was immediate. She looked tired. Her eyes betrayed sleepless nights. Seeing this hit Michael hard. As a war veteran, he recognized the signs of emotional exhaustion. He knew his absence hadn't gone unnoticed. Michael didn't start with justifications. He didn't try to defend himself. He told the truth. He said he was afraid. He said the war had taught him to survive, but not to live. He said he carried guilt he didn't know how to let go of. He said he had distanced himself because he believed he was protecting them both, when in reality, he was just repeating his own trauma. For a war veteran, admitting this out loud was more difficult than any mission he had ever faced. Emily listened in silence. She didn't interrupt, she didn't downplay it. When she spoke, her words were firm but compassionate. She didn't need a hero. She didn't need him to be perfect. She needed him to be present. She needed him not to disappear when things got tough. That moment was the true climax. Not because it solved all the problems, but because it broke an old pattern. Michael realized, with painful clarity, that his greatest struggle had always been against the idea that he needed to face everything alone. As a war veteran, he had been trained for this. As a man, it was costing him everything. The overcoming began there, in the conscious decision to stay. But the climax didn't end with that conversation. It extended to another inevitable confrontation. Emily's father. Not for revenge, not for pride, but for closure. Michael knew that if he didn't confront that situation definitively, it would continue to cast shadows over the future. The meeting was tense, but different from previous ones. Michael wasn't there to prove anything. He was there to establish clear boundaries. He presented himself for the first time completely. He said he was a veteran of the United States wars, not as a rhetorical weapon, but as part of who he was. He said he carried scars, visible and invisible, and that he was no longer ashamed of them. The man tried to scoff again, but encountered something different. Michael didn't react with tension. He didn't react with anger. He reacted with quiet conviction. For a war veteran, that stance was a sign of true strength. He made it clear that he wouldn't tolerate disrespect, that Emily was a grown woman, capable of making her own choices. That control wasn't love. The impact was silent, but profound. Emily's father didn't transform suddenly, but he retreated. And in that context, retreating was already a form of defeat. As he left, Michael felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Lightness. Not because everything was resolved, but because he no longer carried the weight of having remained silent. As a war veteran, he had always known that some battles aren't won, they simply end. The overcoming continued in small gestures. Michael began to accept help. He sought out a support group for war veterans in the region. He sat in a room with other men and women who carried similar stories. For the first time, he spoke without feeling he needed to hide parts of himself. He heard accounts that reflected his own fears. He realized he wasn't alone. Emily was present throughout this process, but not as a savior. As a partner, she respected his pace but didn't allow him to retreat into absolute silence. For a war veteran accustomed to commanding or obeying, learning to walk alongside someone was an unexpected and liberating challenge. The climax of Michael's journey was not the elimination of trauma, it was its integration. The war veteran understood that his experiences defined him not only by pain, but also by resilience, empathy, and the ability to protect without destroying. Overcoming the tragedy wasn't the end, it was a turning point. Michael knew there would be difficult days, that the ghosts of war wouldn't completely disappear. But for the first time, he didn't feel condemned to face them alone. The war veteran, returning from the battlefield believing he would never be whole again, began to accept a new truth. He didn't need to go back to being who he was before the war. He could become someone new without erasing the past. And at that moment, that was enough to move forward. For Michael Carter, for a veteran of the United States wars, the outcome didn't come as a closed, perfect, or idealized ending. It came as real life often does for those who have survived battles that don't appear in photographs. Silently, gradually, and profoundly transformatively. There wasn't a single moment when everything fell into place. Rather, there was a sequence of small choices that, together, changed the course of his existence. The small American town remained the same. The quiet streets, the simple shops, the people repeating almost unchanging routines. But Michael no longer walked through those places in the same way. As a war veteran, he still carried an attentive posture, a gaze that assessed surroundings before relaxing. This would never completely disappear. The difference was that now he didn't feel like a stranger in his own life. Michael began to allow himself to occupy space, not just physically, but emotionally. He regularly attended a support group for war veterans. He learned that sharing stories didn't diminish his strength. On the contrary, it amplified it. Hearing other war veterans talk about guilt, fear, and rebuilding helped Michael understand something essential. War doesn't end when the uniform is put away. It ends, little by little, when the veteran decides not to let it define everything he is. Emily walked beside him in this new chapter, not as someone who fixed him, but as someone who saw him when he himself refused to do so. Their relationship wasn't built on grand promises, but on presence, on honest conversations, on silences shared without fear. For a war veteran accustomed to relationships based on command and orders, learning to build something with equality was one of the most challenging and most healing experiences of his life. The conflict with Emily's father hadn't completely disappeared, but it had lost the power it once held. Boundaries were established. Distances were respected. Michael understood that not all battles need to be won for there to be peace. Some simply need to be concluded with dignity. As a war veteran, he had always known when a mission was complete. Now, he applied that same discernment to life. Over time, Michael began to reconnect with parts of himself he believed were dead. Small habits returned, dawn walks, moments of quiet contemplation, a genuine interest in the people around him. He became known not just as the quiet war veteran, but as someone reliable, present, and human. The city, which had previously observed him from a distance, began to recognize him as part of the whole. There were difficult days, nights when dreams still took him back to the battlefield, moments when the weight of the past seemed too heavy. But now, Michael wasn't facing it alone. He had finally learned that asking for help wasn't a sign of weakness. For a war veteran, this was perhaps the hardest lesson to accept, and the most liberating. On a quiet afternoon, sitting next to Emily on a simple bench, watching the slow movement of the city, Michael had a clear realization. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Not to society, not to the past, not to the ghosts he carried. He had already survived the worst. Now he was learning to live with what remained. The war veteran who once believed he would never be loved began to understand that love does not demand perfection. It demands presence, truth, courage to stay even when running away seems easier. War had taught him to resist. Life, finally, was teaching him to surrender to what is human. Michael never stopped being a veteran of the United States wars. That identity was part of him, shaping his scars, his values, his way of seeing the world. But it was no longer a prison. It had become an integral part of who he was, not the whole of him. The outcome of Michael's journey was not forgetting the trauma, but reconciliation with it. It was not erasing the pain, but building meaning from it. He understood that honoring those who did not return did not mean living half a life. It meant living with purpose, with integrity, with emotional courage. The moral of this story lies not in grand heroic gestures, but in the silent choices made every day. Sometimes, the greatest bravery of a war veteran is not in facing external enemies, but in allowing themselves to be seen, loved, and cared for. Sometimes, surviving is not the end of the journey. It's just the beginning of another, even more difficult and more valuable one. And so, in a small town, far from the battlefields that once defined his life, Michael Carter moved on. Not as a man healed of all pain, but as someone whole despite it. Because some scars don't need to disappear for there to be peace. They just need to stop controlling the future. And in the end, Michael learned what the war never taught him. That truly living is also an act of courage. If this story has reached you in some way, it may not have been by chance. Stories like Michael's exist to remind us that no one carries everything alone, and that even after the greatest battles, it is still possible to find meaning, connection, and a new beginning. If this content made a difference to you, consider subscribing to the channel. Here, each story is crafted with care, depth, and respect, always leaving you with something real to take away after the video ends. If you want, leave a comment saying, "This message was for me." I'll know that you made it to the end and that this journey touched you too. If you felt that connection throughout the video, a like really helps keep this kind of content alive here. There's a video right next to this that continues this theme and delves even deeper into this reflection. Click on it and follow along with me there. We'll continue this conversation in the next video.